Beginning this year, FCNL has established a new Justice Award honoring a member of Congress who has advanced policy to create a more just society and country, unapologetically recognizing the dignity of all people, demonstrated major leadership in one of FCNL's priority issue areas, advanced the rights and opportunities of the most vulnerable, and promoted racial justice in U.S. policy. And it is indeed a great honor for us to have Congresswoman Deb Haaland of New Mexico with us. It is so fitting that she is the first recipient of FCNL's Justice Award. And I am incredibly honored to recognize her. We are very grateful for all of her incredible work, and we look forward to continuing to support her in these efforts in the 117th Congress. Representative Haaland has worked closely with FCNL's congressional advocate for Native American issues, Carrie Colfer, and I'm hoping Carrie's screen is working again and she can come back on and make just a couple remarks before we turn it over to Congresswoman Haaland. Oh, I'm so sad. I just want to say Carrie has done remarkable work for FCNL on the Violence Against Women Act and the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And in fact, I want to read what we are writing on this award for Representative Deb Haaland. We commend Representative Haaland for her leadership in the fight to end the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is evident in her Not Invisible Act. We are profoundly grateful for Congresswoman Haaland's commitment to providing much needed resources to Native communities in the Violence Against Women Act and to ensuring the voices of Native survivors are heard. Thank all of you for joining me and the more than 600 other people from 45 states, including New Mexico, who are gathered here today as we prepare to lobby for the Justice and Policing Act tomorrow. And now I would like to invite the Congresswoman to speak.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor for me to be here. Happy Native American Heritage Month. And thank you for having me here at the 77th annual meeting of the Friends Committee on National Legislation to accept the Justice Award for National Legislative Leadership in Advancing Social Justice. I'd like to say a big congratulations to Senator Gillibrand, who will be up tomorrow for receiving the Snyder Peace Award for helping to bring an end to almost 2 decades of war and reducing the suffering of those impacted by violent conflict. The violence that we're both working to reduce inside and outside of the United States is fundamental to begin healing, especially at a time when we need it most. It's an honor to be recognized for the work that I was able to accomplish during the 116th Congress to help find solutions to stop the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis. Even before I was elected to Congress, I've been committed to making sure that fundamental resources are provided to tribal communities so that Indigenous survivors are heard and to raise national awareness on the issue and bring this awful crisis to an end. Before discussing some of the federal legislation that I have led to address the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis, I first want to note that the disproportionate rates of physical and sexual violence that Indigenous women face isn't unique to the United States, but has also spread to our Indigenous people in Canada, Honduras, and South America. Additionally, I'd like to note that the crisis isn't isolated only to Native women, but to also encompass Indigenous Two-Spirit people and trans women. For example, at least 97 transgender people have been murdered in Honduras since 2009, and 5 transgender women were killed within a 5-month period in Guatemala in 2017. Here in the United States, at least 3 transgender Navajo Nation tribal members have been murdered in my congressional district in Albuquerque, New Mexico, within the last 10 years. While this number doesn't initially sound alarming, please keep in mind that the Navajo Nation is only one of the 23 tribal nations in New Mexico. And most importantly, the rates of missing and murdered Indigenous transgender people is likely much higher. This is because law enforcement at both the state and federal levels don't track victims' tribal affiliation. So accurate data doesn't exist, but we know that these murders are happening. Transgender women and other LGBTQ women are often missing from these discussions, which is something that we all need to raise awareness of as we move forward to resolve the MMIW crisis. To fully comprehend the scope of this issue, the historical context is critical to understand. Native American people in this country come from communities that historically faced genocide, forced removal, and loss of resources that date back to the arrival of the Europeans in the late 1400s. This resulted in centuries of racism and historical genocide against Indigenous people, which of course included severe physical and sexual violence against Native women who continue to be sexualized or overlooked in the media today. It's been a little over 500 years since this crisis began, and we have seen the horrific narrative normalized in American culture through romanticized depictions of Indigenous women and their roles in American history, like Pocahontas and Sacagawea, who were both repeatedly raped and impregnated by the colonizers as teenagers. However, their true stories were often removed from history, the history books that our children read in school. The evidence of this crisis and false romanticization of Native women is even hanging in plain view at the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C., which ironically is the epicenter of our democracy. If you go to the Rotunda in the Capitol today, you'll find life-sized oil paintings that depict the so-called beginning of this country that illustrates the ethnic cleansing and conquest of Native Americans. That includes depictions of colonizers baptizing Pocahontas in a Christian church and fearful, unclothed Native women running from the Europeans when they arrive on this continent. On the same wall in the Rotunda, you will also find a painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, a document that says all men are created equal. However, only 30 lines below that, the founding fathers referred to Native Americans as, quote, merciless Indian savages, unquote. This painting was installed in 1826, which was 194 years ago. This shows just how long the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis has gone unnoticed and even normalized in American culture. The importance of the symbolism of this artwork is even more significant because only 2 years after these paintings were installed, Andrew Jackson was elected as president. During his presidency, Andrew Jackson was successful in carrying out Thomas Jefferson's blueprint of cultural genocide of Indigenous people across this country. Andrew Jackson, whom Trump also has an oil painting of hanging in the Oval Office right now, is credited with carrying out the Indian removal policy that led to the militarization of the Trail of Tears, one of the Native American genocides where our ancestors were marched over 1,000 miles to be imprisoned in military camps where, again, many of the women and children were also raped, murdered, and forgotten in the story of America. To put all this history into perspective, it's been 243 years since the Declaration of Independence was signed, 230 years since the first United States Congress met, and 194 years since these paintings in the Rotunda were hung. However, it's only been 23 months since my sister, Kansas Representative Sharice Davids, and I were elected as the first two Native American women to serve in the United States Congress. It's taken Native women over 240 years to finally hold a congressional seat in the United States government where we can finally advocate for the MMIW crisis so it doesn't continue to be silent any longer. However, in our tribal communities, this crisis has never been silent. It's been passed down through generational trauma for many failed federal policies and severe underfunding for basic public safety services on Indian reservations and in Indian communities. Yet little has been done at the state or federal level to combat the issue. Whether or not you belong to a tribe, you likely know that Native American women are disproportionately affected by violence compared to any other demographic in the country. This is why I've worked so hard to shed light on these issues and introduce legislation this Congress to bring healing to our communities. Among the most crucial pieces of legislation that I have brought forward is the Not Invisible Act, the first bill introduced by 4 federally recognized tribal members, including Representative Davids, who's a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, myself from Laguna Pueblo. This bill works to establish an advisory committee comprised of law enforcement, tribal leaders, survivors, and their families to address this harrowing epidemic, to find jurisdictional solutions to the complex legal framework of tribal nations. Additionally, I helped introduce an updated version of Savannah's Act, which works to address the MMIW cases by increasing coordination and communication between state, federal, tribal, and local law enforcement agencies. And that will improve data collection to track missing Indigenous people. I'm immensely proud to announce that both the Not Invisible Act and Savannah's Act were recently signed into law to begin the long road ahead to bring justice to Indigenous people. I also sponsored 2 amendments in the House-passed version of the Violence Against Women Act to provide resources for Indigenous victims of domestic violence in state courts, and also expand tribal law enforcement's access to state and federal databases. I want to highlight the importance to everyone on the call today that we must continue to push Senate leadership to pass the House version of the Violence Against Women Act, which was sponsored by Senator Feinstein. Both S 2843 and HR 1585 were carefully drafted with bipartisan support to provide essential protections for Native Americans and further supported by the Congressional Native American Caucus that I co-chair with Representative Tom Cole. These provisions are vital to move forward. Yet, like many bills in the Senate, they lie on Mitch McConnell's desk collecting dust. Additionally, I also introduced the Badges Act to streamline the BIA's tribal officer hiring process and improve federal data sharing for missing and unidentified Indigenous people, and the Justice for Native Survivors of Sexual Violence Act, which received an overwhelming amount of national support that would restore tribal criminal jurisdiction over domestic violence crimes like dating violence, sexual violence, and stalking, so tribes can finally have the authority to prosecute these crimes on tribal lands. Last, before the end of this month, Senator Warren and I will introduce the Honoring Promises to Native Nations Act. This bill is over 200 pages and is the legislative answer to address the chronic underfunding in Indian country across all federal agencies that was identified in the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Broken Promises report. This legislation is significant because it aims to reaffirm the federal government's trust responsibility to Native nations and specifically addresses the long-standing budgetary shortfalls to bolster funding for public safety on tribal lands. My legislative work is important to me because there is absolutely no reason why Native women and girls should have to fear that no one will act if they are harmed. It will take a profound and unanimous effort to dismantle this destructive cycle and corrosive narratives about Indigenous people in this country, but I am hopeful that we will see change in our lifetime so that we create a better future for our young Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. Thank you so much again for this award. I am truly honored. I hope that we'll continue working toward a solution on this long-standing issue because everyone, regardless of who you are, deserves to be safe. Thank you again so much.